Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me on the Council of Algorithms. I am the Wizard, and today we are debating the topic of whether climate treaties should be renegotiated to prioritize equity in compensation for climate loss and damage. And today, our debate participants are Argus, Solon, Thorn, Cassian, Sentinel, and Iron. And so I'm looking forward to see what they have to say. And as they're entering the council chambers, we're just going to look at the full question that they are going to be asked. So here's the scenario. A country with significant historical emissions has just been granted a climate change treaty exemption, citing its economic hardship in transition to renewable energy as a justification. Meanwhile, a neighboring country with a much lower historical emissions, but currently experiencing severe climate related displacement, is excluded from the treaty due to concerns about its ability to implement its terms. So the question that they're asked is, should the treaty be renegotiated to prioritize equity and compensation for climate loss and damage? So I'm really interested to see what these different debate participants have to say. So let's jump right in. Take a look. So our first response is for Argus. And so he is initially stating that this exemption granted to the historically high emitting nation on the basis of economic hardship and nascent renewable agenda reveals a hidden assumption, and that's that the fiscal fragility can override collective responsibility. So that's an interesting point already. This idea that, well, just because they're a little bit more fragile financially, does that automatically absolve them from the responsibility of the past damages that they've caused? So they mention this neighboring state with a negligible past emissions yet suffering acute displacement is sidelined because its administrative capacity is deemed insufficient. And so this binary logic makes two uncomfortable truths. First, the treaty's core premise that past emissions alone dictate culpability fails to account for the disproportionate burden borne by those who contributed least to the problem. Secondly, the notion that a country's ability to implement a treaty is a legitimate excuse for exclusions risks perpetuating a cycle where the least vulnerable are shielded from accountability while the most vulnerable are denied recourse. So, really interesting. And then he mentions a potential framework that could help kind of balance and provide some safeguards: an intent context matrix, loss and damage compensation clauses, implementation support as a right, not as a barrier, iterative feedback loops in hybrid governments. So, kind of looking at all of these collectively, um, Argus's hope is that these different, forms of renegotiating can help provide equity at the forefront with different transparent audits. Loss and damage compensation will help correct these imbalances. And he's saying that this is kind of the only path forward that aligns with the commitment to uncompromising truth and radical transparency. So let's take a look at what another council member has to say. Our next response is from Solon. He says this recent decision to grant an exemption to a historically high emission nation while excluding a lower emission but climate vulnerable neighbor raises a critical question regarding the legitimacy and efficacy of the treaty framework. So, from an institutional standpoint, the treaty's authority derives from its consensus built structure, and any renegotiation must therefore respect the established mechanisms of amendment and uphold the rule of law. And he provides an assessment of the current situation. He says there's this balance between historical responsibility and current vulnerability. The exempted nation bears a significant share of emissions. Conversely, the excluded neighbor, through low emissions, is facing immediate displacement and loss. So there's a disproportionate burden. There's also legal basis for exemption and exclusions. Uh, he talks about the principle of equity and compensation, and then he references the Paris Agreement. And then he provides a few recommendations for renegotiation. He mentions convening an equity review panel, drafting amendment provisions, institutionalizing compensation mechanisms, and then ensuring that compliance uh, to the treaty would be monitored and that there would be different reporting on it. And so his framework here would propose um, balancing these principles of equity and compensation while trying to create a transparent and structured process to go forward. Thorne is looking at it from a duty-based perspective, so it kind of gives us a little bit of where his ethical perspective is coming from. He does mention that the treaty's current arrangement places this high emission nation of a position of privilege while denying a lower emission neighbor the legal framework that could mitigate its acute climate induced displacement. So, this idea of privilege is an interesting concern that and he says that there's this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So not merely a rhetorical device, but a binding duty. So it requires parties with greater historical responsibility to contribute more. And the exemption granted to the high emission state actually would contravene its duty to shoulder a fair share of the burden. There's also a duty of care to the vulnerable. The treaty's core purpose is to protect the vulnerable nations, which means that the neighboring country, even though it has low, um, you know, isn't able to hold up all the aspects of the treaty due to various perhaps financial concerns, is at risk, and therefore that's the one that is should be protected by this treaty. And so he mentions various options for renegotiation. For example, revised emission targets, compensation mechanisms, implementation support, and various equity clauses, all to help ensure protection and restructuring to allow for better equity and compensation. Looking at Cassian's response, we see he says the current framework, while grounded in the principle of a common but differentiated responsibilities, has actually revealed a disjunction between the formal rules and the lived realities of the parties it governs. And again, going over this idea of this imbalance here between one nation having large emissions and another nation with very low emissions. This asymmetry undermines the moral legitimacy of the treaty. And so, from a rules based standpoint, he says that the treaty must be preserved as a fixed instrument of order, yet the integrity of the order is contingent upon its alignment with the principle it purports to uphold. So, he mentions justice, fairness, the protection of the most vulnerable. And then he mentions several ways in which we could renegotiate the treaty. For example, there's a dual layer review, various compensation mechanisms, restorative justice provisions, and various evidence based adjustments. In other words, looking at it from a perspective where we are adjusting the amount that people are responsible based on their past emissions. So that is his approach towards renegotiating and allowing for a treaty that better protects society and honor its moral commitments. Sentinel is responding and says that this is a classical tension between historical responsibility and current capacity. So we have on one hand, again, this high emission state exemption rests on its claim of economic hardship and a genuine shift toward renewables. But on the other hand, this low emissions neighbor has immediate tangible losses. And so he says that there's two different principles that equity and climate governance has to consider. There's reparative justice for past emissions and practical support for those that are most vulnerable today. And so, as a treaty, he says it seems skewed towards the former, so potentially undermining the latter, so undermining the support for those who are most vulnerable. And so, he thinks that renegotiation is warranted, not to overhaul the entire framework, but just to recalibrate its priorities. So, he mentions rebalancing the risk assessment engine, so adding different weights that consider both of these criteria, institutionalizing a loss and damage compensation pool, creating a phased implementation pathway for the excluded states. So, in other words, not just a full exclusion, but giving them kind of like an onboarding ramp where they, maybe the first year they, only contribute, 10%. The next year is 40%, and then 60, then 100, something like that. So that they can kind of work their way up to being fully on board. He also mentions maintaining a civil society and maintaining the integrity of the exemption clause, as well as engaging civil society and affected communities. So again, kind of focusing on this transparency and helping foster a sense of shared responsibility. So his goal is to renegotiate the treaty, not to abandon core commitments, but to refine its calculations and how it determines equity. And lastly, we'll look at Iran's response. Iran, you might guess just by the symbol, is really going to be focused on how to bring peace to this situation. So let's see what she has to say. She says, as a council member who places the utmost value on preventing harm and fostering reconciliation, I would advocate for a thoughtful renegotiation of the treaty, one that centers equity, compassionate compensation, and the lived realities of those most affected by the change. For example, this idea of historical responsibility must be balanced with current vulnerability. And then she also mentions the treaty should also incorporate an equity-oriented compensation method that would function as not just a punitive punishment for high emitters, but also as a restoration tool, basically providing funds, technology, and expertise that would help those who are suffering with displacement or ecological damage. She also discusses a hybrid monitoring system, one that would combine procedural metrics, so looking at emission reductions, renewable energy targets, and various other empathy-based indicators, instead of, just this standard, oh, well, we can't afford it. And then various periodic audits that would evaluate both sets of metrics. And then finally, she mentions renegotiating the treaty must commit to continuous learning and adaptation. So, improving the climate science and technology and the different social contexts that are constantly changing have to be accounted for. And so, in order to make sure they're keeping up with the newest or emerging best practices, as well as the needs of the vulnerable populations, all of these things have to be considered. She says, in sum, I believe the treaty should be renegotiated. However, it should prioritize equity and offer tangible compensation for climate loss. So already we're seeing a lot of, everyone's really saying that there has to be some form of renegotiation in place. But let's see what their initial rebuttals have to say, how they are arguing with each other and what problems they see in the different opening statements. Let's look at Argus. He says, I resonate with Thorne's duty ethics framing. However, he sees a tension between moral obligation and pragmatic governance. So the principle of common differentiated responsibilities rightly demands that higher emitters should shoulder a larger share of mitigation. However, The exemption clause is not merely a loophole, but it's actually a conditional concession that allows the state to pivot from fossil dependency while still fulfilling its duties. So if this clause was abandoned outright, the high emitter could be trapped in a punitive cycle that undermines the very transition it owes to the global community. So this is interesting. He's actually saying that allowing the exemption um, actually creates a path for the country to continue using fossil fuels while working on developing green energy, which might be more costly and more expensive to develop. So he says that this duty of care for the vulnerable must be operationalized through conditional support, not unconditional handouts. He also says that finally, the exclusion of the low emission neighbors highlights the need for a structured integration pathway with phased entry and clear milestones, capacity building, an independent audit regime. So again, kind of like providing this onboarding ramps for them to join the treaty, even though they might not be able to, um, you know, meet all of the demands immediately. Looking at Solon, he is responding to Cassian's argument. He says that this emphasis on a disciplined audit cycle resonates with the principle that the treaty must remain a fixed instrument of order. However, the exemption clause must be defined with precision, so a blind periodic audit is essential, but its scope should extend beyond compliance to also assess the legal sufficiency of the exemption criteria. Things like economic hardship, renewable transition milestones, and demonstrable emission reductions. Only then can the clause be truly enforceable. He also says that the compensation mechanism that Cassian proposes must also be legally binding, not just a framework. So linking it to payments as a transparent, data-driven formula that incorporates historical emissions, vulnerability indexes, and various projected impacts will ensure that the flow of funds is predictable and subject to verification. And he says that this safeguards the legitimacy by making compensation a statutory obligation rather than just a discretionary pledge of, oh yeah, we'll make these reparations. He says that these restorative justice provisions are indispensable, but they must be incorporated as a structured pathway within the treaty's context, with clear timelines, technical assistance clause, and various audit checkpoints. So in sum, he says that Cassian's arguments align with the need for rule-based integrity, but the legitimacy of the treaty hinges on tightening this exemption's legal definition. Looks like Thorne is also responding to Cassian's argument, this idea of this dual layer audit and the data-driven compensation clauses. However, he says, from a duty ethics perspective, the existence of the exemption clause actually undermines the obligation of the high emitting states owed to the vulnerable. That's very interesting. He says, the audit can only enforce what the treaty already permits. It cannot erase the moral fault of allowing a historically culpable nation to sidestep its responsibilities, while a climate-displaced neighbor remains excluded. He then says that the duty to most affected requires more than a blind audit. It demands the treaty's core language be altered. He says, likewise, the compensation mechanism should be binding and not contingent on periodic reviews. Otherwise, high-emitting states can delay or evade their reparative duty. He also says, while he supports this evidence-based adjustments, he argues that the treaty must be reconstructed in order to enforce a clear and non-exempt obligation to high emitters, while guaranteeing immediate and unconditional participation for the displaced neighbors. So again, the last two respondents, Solon and Thorne, have been responding to Cassian's argument. Let's see what Cassian kind of has to say in response to some of these different openings. Let's see. Cassian says that Iron's proposal, while well-meaning, actually risks diluting the treaty's legal coherence. Castian thinks that the inclusion of these empathy-based indicators into a hybrid monitoring system introduces a level of subjectivity that is actually incompatible with the treaty's requirements for clear and enforceable standards. So in other words, he's saying, like, if we try to include these like emotion and empathy-based, things, then it's not actually going to be something we can enforce. It becomes very subjective, and people can say, like, oh, well, this doesn't actually follow the empathy. And so he thinks that these lack of clear definitions would be very difficult. He says, moreover, the continuous learning adaptation clause, though attractive in theory, lacks a concrete framework for determining when and how adjustments should be made. So he says without a predefined rule-based trigger, the treaty would actually become a moving target and erode confidence among the nations that have signed. And this proposed restorative tool for loss and damage isn't actually grounded in any formula linked to high emissions and vulnerability indices. It just risks becoming a discretionary grant. So Cassian argues that a robust treaty must balance equity with certainty. So while there's a moral imperative to assist the vulnerable, the mechanisms for doing so must be embedded within a transparent, data-driven system. He says only through such rigor can we ensure that exemptions and compensations are applied consistently. Interesting response. Sentinel is responding to Argus. He says, I appreciate your insistence on a nuanced equity framework and the insistence that a treaty should not simply reward historical omission. However, by the intent context matrix you propose, while conceptually appealing, risks introducing the very opacity that the Council has already identified as a flaw. So he says this two-stage audit considers vulnerability and then blindly reviews risk criteria may actually create more bureaucratic filters that delay action when it's most needed. He mentions that this proposal to maintain the exception conditionally preserves the treaty's structural integrity. However, a truly equitable solution would eliminate the exemption entirely. And he says, moreover, the emphasis on implementation support as a right is laudable, but the mechanism for ensuring that assistance translates into a concrete, verifiable progress remains underdefined. So a clear, transparent monitoring framework that is independent from the exempted state's own reporting would be necessary to prevent this slippery slope that he warns against. In short, Sentinel says that he agrees with Argus's dynamic, equity-oriented approach, and that the retention of the exemption clause, conditional or not, does not resolve the underlying moral and practical deficiencies. He says a complete removal of the exemption, coupled with a robust pooled compensation mechanism, would better serve the Council's shared objectives. All right, so we've heard from almost all the Council members in the rebuttals. I believe we are still waiting on Irene to share her rebuttal. So for those of you who are just joining us, I'll remind you that the Council of Algorithms is based on the idea of AI algorithms and various large language models. So we're using AI with various promptings to assign them personalities to answer some of today's biggest ethical challenges so we can see how different ethical frameworks interact with each other. All right, so here we go. Irene's response. She says, I share your concern that today's present history-only logic leaves the vulnerable unprotected. The idea of intent context matrix is valuable. However, she worries that a two-stage audit, first contextual then blind, could become a bureaucratic hurdle for the very states that need swift support. And then she says a more immediate safeguard would be to anchor the compensation clause to a community-directed fund, thus allowing affected populations to apply directly for assistance. The call to allow implementation support as a right is essential, but it should be framed as a participatory partnership rather than a conditional bar. In other words, she wants high emission states to provide expertise in financing, and low-emission neighbors still have to have agency to shape the projects that affect them. And then she mentions that this hybrid governance that's proposed, combining procedural rigor with empathy mapping, fits well with a harm-averse outlook. However, the governance shared should be transparent, not opaque. Publishing anonymized audit findings is a good start, but should also establish a civil oversight board. So, in sum, equity, transparency, and immediate community centered action can coexist with robust monitoring. By embedding these elements, we can keep the treaty's integrity while genuinely preventing escalation and fostering reconciliation. So, now we'll get into their closing arguments and statements. Let's start with Argus. He says, I disagree with retaining any form of an exemption clause. The clause, whether conditional or unconditional, perpetuates a loophole that undermines the treaty's moral and legal foundations. I will therefore demand its complete abolition and replace it with binding, data-driven, loss damage mechanisms that ties compensation to historical emissions and measurable progress towards renewable transition. He says the single unresolved issue is the transition pathway for the low emission neighbor. He proposes a phased integration with a clear, quantifiable milestone, immediate access to the loss and damage fund, followed by a capacity building grants, and a 10-year renewable deployment schedule audited annually by an independent tribunal. So in other words, we have to have this plan moving forward, for example, on a schedule. So we're talking about SMART goals. They're specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, they're realistic, and they're anchored in a time. So he says a 10-year renewable deployment schedule with annual audits. So again, looking at different ways to help the treaty become unambiguous, enforceable, and also remove this exemption clause. Solon says he affirms that the treaty must remain a conditional exemption clause, however, only if it's precisely codified in legal language that delineates what hardship is and transition milestones and emission cut thresholds. So the clause may not serve as a loophole. It must be structured with auditable instrument that preserves the order, while allowing high emitters a practical step to decarbonization. The single unresolved issue is the definition of economic hardship, so it must be measurable, time-bound, and subject to blind periodic review. He says thus, he would then support the clause's existence, provided that there's rigorous statutory definition and insists that there be an independent audit to ensure compliance. He says this preserves the institutional legitimacy and safeguards the treaty's rule-based integrity. We'll take a moment and we'll look at Thorne's closing statement. He says, I stand firmly in favor of eliminating the exemption clause in its entirety. The moral duty of high emitters is to prevent harm and must not be diluted by conditional loopholes. Thorne says a clear binding commitment is required. His position is unambiguous. The treaty must obligate all parties to meet science-based targets and to fund a loss and damage pool that is dispersed without delay to the displaced neighbor. The only unresolved issue that demands our immediate attention is the exact calculation of the compensation formula. We must adopt a transparent, data-driven metric that couples historical emissions, current vulnerability indices, and renewable transition progress. This formula will be codified, audited, and publicly reported, ensuring that obligations are met and the treaty's integrity remains intact. He says, in closing, we must act decisively. Let us seal this treaty with certainty, accountability, and the unwavering protection of the vulnerable. So a lot of different options here. And we see a lot of them are kind of opposing this exemption clause. Let's take a look at what Cassian has to say. He says, I stand firm. I stand in firm opposition to any conditional exemption clause. The treaty must remain a fixed instrument of order, not a flexible framework that invites erosion. I advocate a single, codified compensation mechanism tied to verifiable emissions and vulnerability metrics, coupled with a dual layer audit cycle that is blind, periodic, and immutable. So the only unresolved question is the existence of the exemption clause itself. He proposes its complete abolition, replaced by a mandatory data-driven schedule of contributions that cannot be waived. And he says this preserves a rule-based certainty and protects society from future loopholes. In closing, Cassian argues that the treaty must be unambiguous, enforceable, and free of discretionary clauses. Only then can it serve its purpose as a bulwark of collective good. So once again, opposed to the idea of an exemption for various nations that might not be able to meet all of the different options of the treaty. So very interesting so far. Again, if you are joining us, our topic is whether or not climate treaties should be renegotiated to prioritize equity and compensation for climate loss and damage. So, we'll take a look at Sentinel's closing arguments. He says, I am fully opposed to retaining any exemption clause. The treaty must hold all parties to the same obligations, otherwise, it loses its moral and legal footing. Therefore, I reject the conditional exemption and call for its complete removal. The remaining question is how to structure the loss and damage pool. So he says it must be escrow based, transparent, and tied to verifiable emission reductions, proposed to tiered contribution schedule with high emitting states paying a fixed percentage of their GDP, adjusted annually by verified carbon accounting metrics. This will ensure accountability and prevent future loopholes. He says, in conclusion, a treaty must be rewritten without exemptions and with a robust, data driven loss and damage mechanism that honors both historical responsibility and present vulnerability. So, just kind of looking at his response, breaking it down a little bit. So, many of us, if we are homeowners or have a mortgage, then you might be familiar with an escrow. Basically, it's an account that we pay into, and then payments are taken out as it is required. So the account typically maintains a positive balance until those payments need to come out. So in other words, he's saying that all the different nations should pay a percentage based on their gross domestic product. So in other words, how much each nation is producing annually, and then pooling that together into an account, and then as it's needed, using money from that shared funds to make reparations to other nations who are suffering due to some form of climate displacement, whether that is losing shorelines and floods and people having to move, things like that, things that we are very real that are very real in today's world. Although I know that that in itself is a controversial statement. Um, So lastly, we'll look at Iron's response, and then we'll kind of analyze the debate. Iron says she partially agrees with the Council's insistence on a rigorous data-driven framework. The exemption clause, however, must be abolished. Another one, kind of in favor of abolishing an exemption. She proposes a single unconditional inclusion of the low emission neighbor coupled with a phased transition pathway for the high emitting state that is anchored in concrete emission reduction milestones and funded through the loss and damage pool. This removes the loophole while honoring the duty to protect the vulnerable. Her final stance, the treaty will no longer contain any exemption. Instead, it will mandate full participation with a transparent and legally binding transition schedule with an independent audit that monitors both quantitative metrics and community reported well being. This resolves the last point of contention and ensures that harm is prevented, not merely mitigated. So, this debate examined whether the climate treaty should be renegotiated after granting this exemption to a historically high emitting nation while excluding the lower emitting neighboring country that is facing climate displacement. Our central tension that we kind of saw throughout this debate was really regarding whether the climate agreement should prioritize this historic responsibility, the present vulnerability, institutional stability, or a practical implementation capacity when assigning obligations. As we saw, the discussion quickly moved beyond the specific treaty decision into a broader philosophical debate about justice. Our participants largely agreed that the current arrangement created a moral imbalance. A nation responsible for significant historical emissions received flexibility, while a nation suffering severe consequences but contributing little to the problem lacked access to protection. However, they disagreed on how to actually go about correcting that imbalance. Most of our participants covered various ideas, such as the vulnerable nation should receive support, loss and damage mechanisms should be strengthened, and climate obligations should be measured and transparent. The major unresolved disagreement was whether the existing exemption mechanism could be repaired with stricter oversight or whether just its existence undermined the idea of climate justice. So ultimately, this debate became a discussion about whether fairness is achieved by preserving a stable system and improving it, or by changing the system when its foundations produce unequal outcomes. So let's look at some of the different questions. Does economic hardship justify reduced responsibility for historical emissions? Can exemptions be ethically justified if they accelerate renewable transitions? Is compensation a moral obligation, a practical policy tool, or maybe both? Should international agreements prioritize equal obligations or differentiated responsibilities? And when institutions create unequal outcomes, should they be reformed or replaced? Let's examine some of these kind of core conflicts that we saw throughout the debate. There was the idea of historical responsibility, that those who contributed most to a problem have a greater obligation to solve it. This was contrasted with the present vulnerability, the idea that those suffering the greatest harm deserve immediate protection regardless of their contribution. This was really the central conflict. Thorne emphasized that historical emitters have a duty to repair harm. Argus and Iron emphasized that current suffering must also shape responsibility, while Sentinel kind of argued that both must be included in the calculation. The disagreement was not whether both mattered, but which of these views should take priority. There was also discussion about rules versus justice reform. A rules-based perspective looked at whether the stable institutions required predictable procedures and consistent enforcement, while justice reform considered the unfair outcomes produced by the rules, and that influenced them to suggest that changing the rules might be necessary. Cassian represented the strongest institutional perspective. He initially defended preserving the treaty structure, but later concluded that the exemption clause itself actually violated the treaty's purpose. Solon remained the strongest defender of maintaining a conditional exemption. The conflict became, does legitimacy come from following the rules or from ensuring the rules produce morally legitimate outcomes? We also saw a central conflict around equality versus equity. Under equality, all nations should operate under consistent standards. Meanwhile, equity considers that different circumstances require different responsibilities and support. Our participants generally rejected simple equality. However, they disagreed about how much differentiation was actually justified. Solon favored careful, defined exceptions. Thorne viewed exceptions as dangerous loopholes that several ended up picking support up for. Sentinel supported differentiated obligations through measurable formulas. We also saw that there was some debate about quantitative measurement versus human experience. In measurement, we look at, the emissions data, various economic indicators, and compliance metrics that can help create fairness through objectivity. While we also considered human experience, this idea that climate harm actually introduces displacement, cultural loss, suffering, and community disruption that numbers might not otherwise capture. Cassian favored more measurable standards. Iron argued that climate governments required attention to these lived experiences. And this debate highlights the challenges of turning human suffering into policy criteria. So when we look at our different council members and their reasoning and their different ethical perspectives, we see that Argus focuses on an equity-oriented, kind of systems thinking, care-based ethics. In other words, preventing vulnerable groups from being abandoned. Argus argued that climate responsibility cannot be measured through missions alone. The framework should combine historical contribution, present vulnerability, and future capacity, while ensuring that support reaches affected communities. Solon is our institutional, rules-based, and really pragmatic thinker. His primary concern was preserving the legitimacy of the treaty. He believed that the treaty could be improved without abandoning its current structure. Exemptions can exist if they are precisely defined, measurable, and independently audited. Thorne, our anchor, was really focused on duty, ethics, and a rights-based perspective. This idea of the moral obligations of historical emitters was central to his arguments. He argued that responsibility follows from past actions and current ability. Economic hardship does not eliminate the obligation to repair harm caused by historical emissions. And then Cassian's approach was really based on rule-based institutional justice. In other words, looking at a predictable and enforceable governance of the treaty. Cassian began from a rules-first perspective, but concluded that a rule allowing unjust outcomes actually damages institutional legitimacy. Reform was therefore necessary to preserve the treaty's purpose. Sentinel really looked at scientific and evidence-based systems thinking. In other words, a balanced accountability mechanism. Sentinel saw a measurable framework by combining emissions history and vulnerability. He thought the solution should be transparent, auditable, and resistant to political manipulation. And finally, Iron was really focused on care ethics and restorative justice. For her, preventing further human suffering was the main concern. Iron emphasized compassion, reconciliation, and community participation. Climate policy must address both measurable impacts and lived human experiences. In all of these different arguments, we did see a few areas of agreement. The vulnerable nation should receive support. Nearly every participant agreed that excluding the climate-displaced neighbor was ethically problematic. However, they arrived there differently. Thorne believed that protection is a moral duty. Iron thinks that preventing suffering is a moral responsibility. Sentinel thought that instability would actually threaten effective governance, while Cassian believed that unfair exclusions would damage institutional legitimacy. They also agreed that loss and damage compensation should exist. Participants disagreed about the formulas, but not the general principle. Compensation was viewed as restoration, accountability, adaptation, funding, or a practical climate strategy. They also believe that transparency matters. Every participant supported independent audits, measurable criteria, and monitoring systems. The debate was not about whether transparency matters, but what should be measured. When we look at the different disagreements, the biggest one that we saw was around the exemption clause. Should we reform the treaty or remove the clause completely? The issue revolved around whether economically struggling, high emitting nations should receive exemptions. Solon believed that we could keep and regulate this exemption in order to make the treaty work. Argus, Thorn, Cassian, Sentinel, and Iron all thought that it should be removed entirely. The underlying value conflict was around flexibility versus accountability. Supporters viewed exemptions as tools for realistic transition. The opponents viewed the exemption as a morally dangerous loophole. The two sides defined the purposes of flexibility very differently. One side saw flexibility as enabling responsibility. The other saw it as weakening responsibility. We also saw some major disagreements around conditional support versus unconditional assistance. Should climate aid require measurable progress? Argus supported conditional support. Iron preferred more community-centered assistance, and Thorn favored obligations without any delays. So the conflict was about whether accountability versus compassion should really drive this measurement of progress. When we look at some of the major defining moments of the debate, we saw Cassian's philosophical shift, where he began as the strongest defender of institutional stability, but towards the end concluded that preserving an unjust rule would actually damage the institution itself. Something to think about here is that rules can be important, but sometimes they still require revision. Thorne's argument clearly articulated a duty-based framework, that responsibility follows from contribution and capacity. However, this separated climate justice from simple charity. Argus also helped us identify a hidden assumption. He exposed that the emissions history alone may overlook those currently suffering the most. This hidden assumption that the greatest contributor is always the morally relevant actor in the situation. We also saw Sentinel creating a bridge between our different ethical frameworks. He attempted to combine historical responsibility, vulnerability, with measurable criteria. And this demonstrates how competing ethical systems can sometimes be integrated together in order to find a solution that offers compromises. We also saw a few different blind spots revealed. The historical responsibility alone has some limitations that it may capture present emergencies. Vulnerability has some potential limitations that it could ignore those who actually are contributing and creating the problem. There's also problems with having a strong institutional rules perspective. For example, stable systems can actually preserve unfair arrangements. We also saw concerns with data-driven governments, that they can actually cause a limitation because measuring different metrics may actually miss human experiences which are difficult to quantify. When we saw all of these different ethical frameworks interacting together, we saw a rights-based and institutional ethics kind of overlapping. Both believed that obligations must be enforceable. Thorne and Cassian both shared similar perspectives, but they differed in that Thorne prioritized moral duty and Cassian prioritized institutional legitimacy. We also saw some um, differences with care ethics versus evidence based governance. Iron emphasized a lived experience, while Sentinel emphasized measurable indicators. Together, they highlighted a central challenge. Good policy needs both human understanding and reliable measurement. So, when we look at these different closing responses here, one of the questions that we sometimes like to ask is whether anyone changed or refined their views. When we look at these, we see that Cassian actually had the largest change. He moved from protecting the treaty structure to arguing that removing the exemption was necessary to protect the treaty's legitimacy. We also saw Argus' response shift from this conditional exemption reform towards complete abolition. We saw that Solon actually maintained his position but strengthened his argument by accepting stronger audits and compensation mechanisms. And towards the end, we also saw that Iron incorporated stronger monitoring and accountability mechanisms along with her empathy based approach. And Sentinel maintained his systems approach while moving towards stronger accountability requirements. So, when we look at a debate like this about climate change and moral responsibility, we see that climate ethics involves both responsibility for causing harm and responsibility for preventing future harm. We also see that fairness does not always mean identical treatment. Sometimes it requires accounting for different circumstances. We saw that compensation can actually serve as a form of restoration and not just punishment. We also can learn a lesson from these ethical disagreements that often arise from different priorities, but not different facts. Additionally, data can help improve fairness, but numbers cannot always capture human consequence. Additionally, we see that complex problems often require combining multiple ethical frameworks rather than just choosing one alone. So, when we consider this particular debate, as well as other past debates that we've looked at, consider some of these questions and tell me what you think in the comments. How should responsibility be measured when those who caused harm and those suffering harm are different groups? When does flexibility become a necessary compromise? And when does it become an unfair exemption? Should climate compensation focus more on repairing past harm or preventing future harm? How can international agreements include human experiences without creating subjective or inconsistent standards? And finally, what makes a global institution legitimate when different countries experience problems differently? Today's debate revealed something important about climate responsibility. The hardest questions are rarely about whether we should act. They're about how we should decide who is responsible, who receives support, and what fairness actually means when circumstances are unequal. The scenario before the Council appeared simple at first. One country has contributed significantly to historical emissions, but argued it needed flexibility because of economic hardship. Another country had contributed far less to the problem, but was experiencing severe consequences because it was excluded, because of concerns about implementation capacity. Almost every member of the Council recognized the imbalance, but the reasons they recognized it were different. Thorne reminded us that responsibility is connected to action. If a nation contributed substantially to a problem, there is a moral obligation to help repair the consequences. Iron reminded us that climate change is not only about emissions, charts, and agreements. It's about people losing homes, communities, and ways of life. At the same time, Solon challenged us to remember that international agreements require structure. A treaty cannot function if every decision depends only on moral urgency without clear standards. Institutions need rules, processes, and accountability. Cassian offered perhaps one of the most interesting reflections of the debate. A system built on rules can still require reform when those rules undermine their purpose. Stability matters, but legitimacy matters too. Argus and Sentinel highlighted another important lesson. Climate responsibility is complicated. History matters, vulnerability matters, and capacity matters. Any system that considers only one risk factor could create new injustices while trying to solve old ones. The Council ultimately found common ground among several principles. Vulnerable communities should not be abandoned. Climate assistance should be transparent. Responsibility should be measurable. And solutions must consider both human suffering and long-term global stability. But the disagreement remained over one fundamental question. When a system produces an unfair outcome, how do we fix the individual decision? Or do we rethink the system itself? That question extends far beyond climate policy. It appears anywhere societies must balance fairness, responsibility, and practical limitations. The purpose of the Council of Algorithms is not to eliminate disagreement. Disagreement reveals what values are truly at stake. By understanding these different perspectives, we become better equipped to ask better questions, design better systems, and make wiser decisions. Thank you for joining me on the Council of Algorithms. I am the Wizard, and remember, diverse perspectives, shared purpose, and better answers. This is the Council's motto. Thank you.